This evening, following Kentucky Andy Beshear's announcement that he will not be attending next week's bipartisan governors meeting at the White House. Beshear explained his decision on CNN's State of the Union today.
Dinner at the White House. It's the people's house. It's also the president's home, and so he can invite whomever he wants to dinners and events here at the White House. I believe Governor Moore was invited last year, and he did not show up.
Tradition, the Trump administration is not inviting any Democratic governors to the National Governors Association's meeting at the White House next week.
Today we're talking about one of the biggest political stories in the United States this week, an unfolding controversy over a long-standing bipartisan tradition and how it suddenly changed in a way that has drawn critics from both sides of the political aisle. This isn't just another story about Washington politics. It's about how state and federal leaders work together, why bipartisan cooperation matters, and what happened when that cooperation was disrupted in a major way. For decades, the National Governors Association, an organization made up of the governors of all 50 U.S. states and leaders from U.S. territories, has hosted an annual winter gathering in Washington, D.C. During that gathering, it has been traditional for governors, both Republican and Democratic, to be invited to the White House by the sitting President of the United States for a face-to-face meeting. This meeting has been seen not just as a ceremonial event, but as a chance for state leaders to speak directly with the president and federal officials about issues that matter to their states, from infrastructure and energy policy to federal funding and emergency response coordination. In early February, however, the White House announced plans for this year's governors' meeting that immediately sparked controversy. Reports emerged that only Republican governors would be formally invited to a White House event. He had visited the White House with a bipartisan group of governors to discuss energy cost reforms and grid reliability, showing that such cooperation can happen when leaders are focused on outcomes instead of partisan divisions. Governor Jared Polis of Colorado, the other governor who was not invited to the White House dinner, also had his invitation revoked, according to early reports. Those actions prompted a backlash among many Democratic governors who felt that tradition and bipartisan engagement were being undermined. As a result of these developments, 18 Democratic governors issued a joint statement saying they would boycott the White House dinner in protest of the exclusion of their colleagues. They argued that it would be inappropriate to attend if all governors were not treated equally and invited to the same events. This collective statement was significant for several reasons. 18 governors represent a large portion of states, nearly one-third of the total, and their unified stance highlighted that this dispute had escalated beyond a simple scheduling decision. Instead, it had become a flashpoint in the broader debate about partisanship and how leaders engage with one another across political lines. In response to the public backlash and growing media coverage, developments continued to unfold. Oklahoma Governor Kevin Stitt, a Republican and the chair of the National Governors Association, sent a letter to fellow governors explaining changes after discussions with the White House. He said that President Trump would be inviting all governors to the main White House meeting scheduled for February 20, describing it as a business breakfast and reaffirming that the event was intended to include leaders across the country, regardless of party. That move was interpreted by some observers as a partial reversal from the initial exclusion of Democrats, at least for the main meeting. However, even after invitations were extended to all governors for that portion of the event, the separate black-tie dinner remained a point of contention. Governor Moore and Governor Polis were still reported to be excluded from that specific dinner invitation, and some Democratic governors maintained they would not attend until all Democratic governors were included. President Trump himself addressed the issue publicly, saying on social media that there had been a misunderstanding over the invitation process and blaming Governor Stitt for misrepresenting his intentions. Trump stated that invitations were sent to all governors except for the 2 Democrats he considered not worthy of being there, a phrase that drew further criticism from many political commentators and leaders. The White House press secretary defended the president's discretion to invite whomever he wanted to White House events, saying it was within the president's authority. But many leaders argued that the tradition of bipartisan inclusion was more important than that legal discretion, even with the invitations extended for the main meeting. Some Democratic governors announced they would still not attend the dinner if their excluded colleagues were kept off the guest list. This situation continued to drive headlines and discussion throughout the week, with both sides making public statements about the importance of tradition, respect, and bipartisanship. For those following closely, it's worth noting the timeline. The controversy began early in the week when plans for the governor's White House meeting were publicized, showing only Republicans on the guest list. By midweek, Democratic governors announced their planned boycott of the dinner. By later in the week, the president and governors engaged in public exchanges about the invitations, and changes were made, although not without ongoing disputes about how those changes were handled and whether they resolved underlying concerns. This entire episode is significant for several reasons. First, it shows how deeply traditions of bipartisan governance are valued by many leaders in the U.S. political system. For decades, governors of both parties have met with the president together, engaging in discussions that cross ideological lines and aim at solving practical problems for their state citizens. Breaking or altering that tradition was seen by many as symbolic, a sign of increased polarization. Second, it highlights how state leaders themselves respond to perceived slights or partisan actions from the federal government. When the invitations were first issued, in a way that excluded Democrats, governors from both parties reacted, and the NGA even chose to withdraw formal support for the White House portion of the meeting. That shows that state leaders view this meeting not just as ceremonial, but as meaningful for their ability to do their jobs effectively. Third, it shows how media and public scrutiny can influence political decisions, with a partial reversal and reopening of invitations after the backlash, even if not every individual was fully satisfied. Finally, this story touches on a broader theme in American politics today: how partisan divides are affecting long-standing institutions and practices that once helped bridge differences. Whether it's infrastructure funding, disaster response, education policy, or public health, governors often depend on direct communication with the White House to coordinate with federal agencies. When those opportunities feel limited or altered for political reasons, it raises questions about how effective governance can remain bipartisan in a highly polarized environment. Whether these governors ultimately meet with the president at the White House in a traditional bipartisan way, or whether some continue to skip portions of the events, remains part of this story. But what's clear is that a decades-long tradition has been disrupted, and that disruption has triggered reactions from leaders across the political spectrum. This moment also brings attention to how rare bipartisan spaces have become in modern American politics. According to data from the National Governors Association, the group has existed for more than 115 years, and since the mid-20th century, its meetings with presidents have been intentionally bipartisan, even during times of war, economic crisis, and intense political disagreement. Governors from both parties have traditionally been invited because states depend heavily on cooperation with the federal government, regardless of which party controls the White House. To understand why this matters, it's important to know that U.S. governors are responsible for managing budgets that together exceed $3 trillion annually. They oversee disaster response, education systems, public safety, transportation, and healthcare programs like Medicaid, which is jointly funded by states and the federal government. Direct access to the president allows governors to raise urgent issues such as wildfire funding, hurricane recovery, border security costs, and infrastructure repairs that can affect millions of residents. For example, during previous administrations, bipartisan governors' meetings helped speed up federal disaster aid after events like Hurricane Katrina, Superstorm Sandy, and major wildfires in California and the West. Governors from both parties have publicly said that these meetings were often less about politics and more about solving immediate problems facing their states. That history is why the change in this year's invitation process stood out so strongly. Another factor adding weight to this story is timing. The controversy comes at a moment when the US is dealing with several major policy challenges at once, including inflation pressures, immigration enforcement, infrastructure spending, energy transition debates, and rising healthcare costs. Governors are on the front lines of implementing federal laws related to these issues, making coordination with Washington especially important. Political analysts also note that governors are often seen as more pragmatic than members of Congress because they must balance budgets and manage real-world crises. Many governors, including Republicans and Democrats, have previously worked together during emergencies, such as the COVID-19 pandemic, when bipartisan coordination helped distribute vaccines and medical supplies. Events like the White House Governors Meeting have traditionally reinforced that cooperative approach. The reaction from Democratic governors, including the decision by 18 of them to boycott the White House dinner, reflects concern not just about symbolism, but about precedent. Some governors have said privately that if bipartisan traditions are broken in one area, it may become easier to exclude political opponents in future federal-state interactions. That concern goes beyond one event and speaks to how governance may function moving forward. Republican leaders, meanwhile, have argued that presidents from both parties have discretion over White House events and that political tensions are unavoidable in a polarized environment. Some Republicans also pointed out that policy disagreements between certain governors and the administration may have influenced personal relationships, even if the broader meeting remained open to all governors later on. Still, the fact that invitations were changed after public backlash shows how sensitive the issue became. Within days, statements were released, letters were sent, and social media posts from political leaders helped shape public opinion. This rapid response highlights how quickly political disputes can escalate in today's media environment and how public pressure can influence decisions at the highest levels of government. Another important detail is the role of the National Governors Association itself. The NGA is not a partisan organization. It is led by one Republican and one Democrat each year, serving as chair and vice chair. When the association expressed concern and withdrew formal participation from parts of the White House event, it sent a strong signal that this was not just a party-line disagreement, but an institutional concern about maintaining long-standing norms. Looking ahead, some political observers believe this episode may affect how future administrations handle bipartisan traditions. If this approach becomes normalized, future presidents, regardless of party, may feel more comfortable reshaping events that were once designed to bring leaders together. Others argue that the backlash itself may reinforce the value of bipartisan engagement and discourage similar decisions in the future. For voters and the general public, this story offers insight into how political divisions at the national level can influence relationships between Washington and the states. While most Americans may never attend a governor's summit or a White House dinner, the outcomes of these relationships can directly affect funding decisions, emergency response times, and policy implementation in everyday life. In the end, this situation is less about one meeting and more about the direction of political cooperation in the United States. Whether leaders choose to rebuild traditions of bipartisan engagement or move further toward party-based decision-making will shape how effectively federal and state governments work together in the years ahead. And as the National Governors Association meeting continues, attention will remain on whether meaningful dialogue happens behind closed doors, even if some symbolic events are skipped. What matters most is whether state and federal leaders can still communicate, negotiate, and cooperate on the issues that affect millions of Americans across all 50 states.